Welcome.
So, welcome everyone to our third and final session in the class on science and religion. And the subject tonight is, does God care? In the first two sessions, we talked a lot, or I talked a lot, you all talked a little bit. I talked a lot about the issue of, does God exist? And by God, I mean a guiding intelligence in the universe. And there's lots of evidence for that. I would say not compelling proof, although I personally am convinced. The second question, second leap of faith, as I usually describe it, is, does God care? And as always, I want to acknowledge the support that I received from the Jewish Federation of Ventura County, and that's made possible by Joel and Barbara Aronson and the Affordable Living Choices Trust. And I think most of you are aware of this, but just in case you're not, I've got a website. And if you click on the website, you'll get to a page that looks a lot like this. There's a classes tab. If you click on the classes tab, you will see a lot of classes that I've taught. And in here, you will see the PDFs of the slides. I need to update that. It's a little old. I have a science and religion bibliography. I have some significant quotes on science and religion and videos of the first two sessions. And as I was telling Dr. Piccioni, as we came on, I saw that I have a book of his, and I wish I had, it literally fell between the cracks on my bookshelf. And it's a book exactly on this subject, science and faith, laid out very, very clearly, and I recommend it to you. The way to get in touch with him is, he has a website. It's Guide to the Cosmos, all one word, no spaces, guidetothecosmos.com. Okay, so here we go with what I describe as leap number 2. Does God care? If God cares, then we must accept the idea of revelation. It is logical to me that if God cares, then God would communicate God's caring. The idea that God cares passionately about us, both collectively and individually, but doesn't bother to make that known to us, seems to me to be logically inconsistent. So this leads us to the idea of God communicating with us. This is what religions mean by revelation, by Bible, by Old Testament, New Testament, Quran, other sacred writings. So the question for Jews, as we'll see, is, how do we understand our revelation? And most of you know that I am a Reform rabbi. And so the question I raise in this connection, do I have to take revelation literally? Can I take it seriously, but not literally? The key question for Jews is, what happened at Mount Sinai? This comes at a very opportune time, since Monday and Tuesday of this week was the holiday of Shavuot, which the rabbis connect with the revelation at Sinai. And if you raise the question, what do we mean by the question, does God care? What I mean by that is, does God care whether I'm kind or mean, protect children or torture them, observe the Sabbath or not, have chicken or pork tonight for dinner? So certainly for Jews, there are hundreds of commandments, and the rabbis add thousands more. And they fall into both ritual issues like the Sabbath and what we eat, and also ethical issues, how we treat one another, animals, and the environment. That's what I mean by God caring. So this, of course, leads to the question of what happened at Sinai. So, the traditional answer is, Moses climbs the mountain and receives a revelation from God. In Jewish tradition, it's more than just the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 Commandments that we receive, but the entire written Torah. And beyond that, the tradition is that Moses received an entire oral law that was never to be written down and was only eventually written down, I would say, some 1,400 years later. So how do I approach this as a Reform rabbi? Clearly, if I take this literally, if I were an Orthodox rabbi, if I took this literally, then I have to struggle and deal with every commandment in the Torah. if I'm not going to take it literally, how do I understand it? So here, my take on this is that something happened, but the revelation that we have, the Bible that we have, the Torah that we have, went through human eyes and hands, and isn't necessarily a perfect record of what God communicated. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So some of you have seen me display this before. And again, we have so many people. What do we have now? We have 58 people. So it's a little hard to have people chime in. But when I ask people, what is this? The answers I usually get is it's a cube, it's a box. But in fact, it's a drawing. And, you know, if I was showing this on a screen, it would be projected light and shadow on a screen. If I were giving it as a handout, it would be carbon dots on a page. Most of you are probably seeing LEDs, light-emitting diodes, being illuminated in various ways on your screen. It's not a cube, and it's not a box. It's a projection. Psychologists tell us that 90% of what we see is conditioned by our culture and our expectations. I would say this affected what gets written down at Sinai. Judith, I think it's Judith Plaskow, a Jewish feminist, points out that the record is that the men wrote down the Torah. Why did the men write down the Torah? Because the women were holding the babies. And so what might our Torah look like if it were the women that had written down the Torah rather than the men? So I admit to getting a little cute here, but and playing with the physics, but I also want to point out that we only see a very small fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum. So, you know, something happened at Sinai. Presumably, the communication was through the electromagnetic spectrum. But we see a very small fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum in invisible light. There are ultraviolet rays, X-rays, gamma rays, infrared radar, and so on. And I love to ask this question. Again, this format doesn't work so well, but I love to ask the question, if this whole distance of the entire electromagnetic spectrum was equivalent to 3,000 miles, what would be the fraction that we see? And I ask people to guess, and people will guess 10 miles or 20 miles or 100 feet. The actual fraction here is smaller than the diameter of a hydrogen atom. So we actually see a very small fraction. We can perceive only a very small fraction of what's going on around us, electromagnetically speaking. And it's a good thing. Imagine if you could hear every cell phone conversation that's floating in the air around you, every radio station, every television station, every shortwave station, all the static that's going on. Thank God we're only attuned to a small fraction. So I would say that affects what gets written down at Sinai. So where I come out on this is I take Torah very seriously. Anybody that studied Torah with me know that. I take it very seriously, but I take it not necessarily literally. Torah is our central myth. And by the word myth here, I use in the highest sense of the word. It is our central, sacred, organizing story. It not only tells the story of the Jewish people, but has legal implications as well. The Torah is true, but it's not necessarily accurate historically, and it's certainly not a science textbook. When I say the Torah is true, what I mean by that is that it's true in the same sense of the truth of the boy that cried wolf. That story, that legend. Most of you have heard the legend, and and I ask sometimes, well, did it really happen? And people, will say, I don't know. And I say, suppose I could prove to you that it never happened. Would that affect the significance and the importance of the story? And of course, the point of the story of the boy that cried wolf is what it teaches, the lessons that it teaches. I would say the same thing is true of Torah and Bible and sacred literature. The significance is in the lessons that it teach. I had a lot of science books and history books, and particularly the science books get quickly obsolete. Torah is, certainly more than 2,000 years old. Even the scholars would say the Torah that we have is about 2,400 years old. It is certainly not obsolete. So the truths that are taught in the Torah are eternal. I read the Torah in many, many ways. Jewish tradition teaches that we are to dig for deeper meanings. There's actually a wonderfully interesting grammatical error between word 1 and word 2 of the Torah, and the interpretation by Rashi and the rabbis is it's teaching us we need to dig and interpret. I'll talk a little bit more about that. So one tradition is that there are 4 levels of meaning in the Torah. There's another tradition that teaches there is 600,000 levels of meaning in the Torah, because there were 600,000 men at Sinai. I love to read the Torah in at least 2 ways. One is traditionally through the eyes of the rabbis, the mystics, the traditional commentators, who absolutely believed and held that Torah is the inerrant word of God, and even the shapes of the letters and the typos that we see have deep, deep meanings. And then I turn around and maybe I take my kippah off and I read it through scholarly eyes, through the historians and the scholars who investigate how the text came to be. And again, for those of you that that come to Torah study, you'll recognize some of this language. There's a theory, a form of analysis that suggests there are at least 4 main voices that were edited together in the Torah. J, E, P, and D. It's called the documentary hypothesis. And we have a similar problem in physics. So let me quote Einstein on this. It seems as though we must use sometimes one theory and sometimes the other, while at times we may use either. We are faced with a new kind of difficulty. We have 2 contradictory pictures of reality. Separately, neither of them fully explains the phenomenon of light, but together they do. So when I study Torah, I've got lots of books behind me because I like to open them and compare them. I want to see what the traditional rabbis say about a text, and I also want to see what modern scholars say about a text. So here's another physicist quoting the Torah, a winner of a Nobel Prize for his work confirming the Big Bang. The best data we have are exactly what I would expect to have predicted had I had nothing to go on but the first 5 books of the Moses, the Psalms, and the Bible as a whole. And clearly the main point there would be the idea that Torah begins with Breshit, with a beginning, and this scholar on the Big Bang also sees it beginning with a starting point. Bryce, you're muted, Bryce.
For me, I'll be brief. For me, the collision between the 2 is, on one hand, if we're blending them as you have discussed, one view on reality and then another view on spirituality, then it comes into the realm of really good advice and words to live by. On the other hand, there are many that take this as commandments from on high that must be obeyed at pain of death, and that is the difficulty for me as to.
I understand. And what I would say is the rabbis are not in that group. The rabbis will take things in the Bible and the Torah with which they are very uncomfortable and dig into them and resolve the inconsistencies as best they can. But yes, you look at it 2 ways, and I would say reality and spirituality are not 2 inconsistent poles, but they are actually aspects of living. So I mentioned the 4 levels, just to add a little more Jewish background to this. There's a concept that studying the Torah is like paradise or a garden called Pardes, and it's an acronym. So the Pei in Pardes stands for Pshat. We read the simple, literal story. The Resh is Remes, which is a hint, or a suggestion. The D is the Dalet is Drash. We dig out and draw an insight. And Sod are secret or mysterious meaning. So I'll just give you a quick example of Sod. When Cain murders his brother Abel, God asks Cain, "Where's your brother?" Cain says, "How do I know? Am I my brother's keeper?" God says, "Your brother's blood cries out to me." But what's written in the Torah is the plural bloods. Now, it may be a typo, but in fact, what the rabbis draw from that plural is that not only is Abel's blood crying out to God, but all the children that will be born of Abel and will now never be born are crying out, leading to the insight and the wisdom that when you murder someone, it's as if you murder an entire world. And when you save a life, it's as if you save an entire life. And in fact, that little bit of wisdom is not only in Jewish, in Talmud and Midrash, it's also verbatim in the Quran. So it's interesting that it reaches both of those. I don't know if Arno Penzias was Jewish. Oh, Cheryl does. Okay. So the question is then, here's a conflict. Was the universe created in 6 days or in 13 billion years? So you can take an allegorical approach. My understanding of the Torah is that the creation story is not a scientific textbook. I don't take it literally. I treat it like The Boy Who Cried Wolf. In fact, the most powerful element of the creation story is not how many days it took, but that it was an orderly, quiet creation aimed toward and leading to the creation of humanity created in God's image. If you look at the other creation myths that were existed around those times, they are violent battles between creatures and gods, and the earth is an accident and humanity is an accident. That to me is the point of the story. But you can take a literal approach. And there's a physicist, Orthodox Jewish physicist, Gerald Schroeder, who loves to go through this text and say we can take it literally. So for some of you who are generally familiar with the theory of relativity, this is actually special relativity. It may well be that 6 days in God's inertial reference frame may be 13 billion years in the Earth's reference frame. And the idea that moving different reference frames that are moving with respect to one another, time moves differently in the different reference frames. That's something that Einstein predicted and has been experimentally verified, many, many, many times. So you can look at the text in both ways. And for me, as I hinted earlier, for me, it's like the question of whether light is a wave or light is a particle. For the purposes of explaining some experiments, we treat light as a wave. For purposes of explaining some other experiments, we treat light as a particle, and we get wisdom out of both of those. And then we can go even deeper into the literal approach. So I may have mentioned this, the mystics would say not only are there secret meanings in the text, but even the shapes of the letters are significant. So the first letter in the Hebrew Bible is a bet. And if you look at a bet, you see it's closed on this direction, closed on this direction, closed on this direction, teaching the only information we can get is in this direction. We can't ask what happened before creation, before Bereshit. And of course, that's exactly what the physicists tell us. And so from one of Schroeder's books, I'll just read quickly a description of what Nachmanides is Nachmanides is a 13th century mystic, and he writes, discussing creation, at the briefest instant following creation, all the matter of the universe was concentrated in a very small place, no larger than a grain of mustard. The matter at this time was so thin, so intangible, that it did not have real substance. It did, however, have a potential to gain substance and form and to become tangible matter. From the initial concentration of this intangible substance in its minute location, the substance expanding the universe as it did so. As the expansion progressed, a change in the substance occurred. This initially thin, non-corporeal substance took on the tangible aspects of matter as we know it. From this act of creation, everything that has existed or will ever exist was, is, and will be formed. So it's very reminiscent of the Big Bang. Barbara, you have a question.
Just a quick question. You said Beit is the first letter. Isn't Aleph is not the first letter?
Beit is the first letter of the Torah, not the alphabet.
Oh,
The opening of the Torah is Bereshit bara Elohim.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. And, you know, I actually use this as evidence for God's caring total eclipses of the sun. The angular size of the moon and the sun as viewed from the earth are almost identical. And in many eclipses, they just barely match over the other, putting on a light show. There is no reason why it should be. I think it's the sun is 400 times the size of the moon, and the moon is but it's 400 times further away, or I'm actually not sure about the numbers, but anyway, the angular size is almost identical. So you get this, you know, you can see the craters there. You can actually see some solar flares and prominences. Yeah, I know I talked about organizing a trip. I probably won't do this. It's really just too much of a hassle, but I'll think about it. Okay, so that's the issue of, does God care? If God cares, the problem that we religious people need to address is the issue of theodicy. The theodicy is the problem of evil and tragedy. While evil is horrible, I actually think it's not such a terribly difficult theological problem. We have evil because we have free will. People will often ask me the question, where was God at Auschwitz? And that's the wrong question. The question is, where was humanity at Auschwitz? People would say, why didn't God step in to stop Hitler, to stop Mengele? And, you know, the question is, where do you stop in that? Bryce?
Yeah, so if the problem for me comes with, if God is the moral authority.
Okay, hold on a second. Bryce, before you ask the
Yeah.
question, let me go through the presentation.
Okay, well, then I'll wait to the end.
You can take it up in the discussion. So Yitz Greenberg, who is Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, who is a Holocaust theologian, asked the awesome and awe-filled and awful question: if God was trying to teach us something in the Holocaust, what would that lesson be? And what he describes it as, the lesson would be that no matter how awful we get and horrible we get to one another, God will not intervene. God, there can be no more eloquent testimony to that than the murder of 1.5 million children in gas chambers. And you know, the Mishnah says free will is given, even though God knows what's going to happen. That's an interesting paradox logically. And in the Torah portion that we read on Yom Kippur, it's clear that we have free will as described in the Torah. This day I call the heavens and earth as witnesses against you, that I've set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life so that you and your children may live. So for me, evil, while it's horrible, it is not a difficult theological problem. What is, and so this is building on the subject, many of you are familiar with the Milgram experiment. Milgram experiment is a very interesting experiment done in the 60s in New Haven. I actually have a little bit of a video. I think I'm going to take a little time to show that to you, where there were volunteers. So you had a experimenter. This is the guy in the lab coat, the white coat, who's doing the psychological experiment. You have a teacher. The teacher recites word pairs to a learner. If the learner makes a mistake, the learner gets a shock. And then if he makes a second mistake, he gets a higher shock. So that's the basic setup, except there's a trick going on here. The learner, they said here, is the confederate of the experimenter. The learner is not actually getting a shock. In fact, the reaction of the learner, as you'll see in this little video I'm going to show, is not even saying anything. There's actually a recording. So every teacher hears exactly the same thing from the learner. And the question is, how far will this ordinary New Haven citizen go in administering electric shocks to another New Haven citizen, simply because it's authorized by an experiment? This is actually what the panel looked like for the we'll call them the teacher. And so there were shocks starting at 15 volts and going up, very strong, intense, extreme intense, danger, and the highest one was 450 volts. So the question was, how many people would actually go to the 450 volt level? When Milgram proposed this experiment, he thought maybe 5%, maybe very few people would go up to the highest level. As we'll see, 65% of people went up to this highest level. And even though it'll take a little time, this is actually an interesting video. The subtitle titles are in, I think, in a Scandinavian language, but it's in English. And can you hear it? Let me ask, can you hear it? Yes. Okay.
When I learn of incidents such as the massacre of millions of men, women, and children perpetrated by the Nazis in World War II, how is it possible, I ask myself, that ordinary people, while courteous and decent in everyday life, can act callously, inhumanely, without any limitations of conscience? Now, there are some studies in my discipline, social psychology, that seem to provide a clue to this question. The problem I wanted to study was a little different. It went a little bit further. It was the issue of authority. Under what conditions would a person obey authority who commanded actions that went against conscience? These are exactly the questions that I wanted to investigate at Yale University. It is May 1962. An experiment is being conducted in the Elegant Interaction Laboratory at Yale University. The subjects are 40 males between the ages of 20 and 50 residing in the greater New Haven area.
Psychologists have developed several theories to explain how people learn. One theory is that people learn things correctly whenever they get punished for making a mistake.
40 years later, Milgram's infamous experiment, obedience, is still taught in classrooms around the world.
All right, teacher, would you take the test and be seated in front of the shock generator, please, in the next room?
But the experiment was rigged.
The victim was an accomplice of the experiment. The victim, according to plan, provided many wrong answers. His verbal responses were standardized on tape, and each protest was coordinated to a particular voltage level on the shock generator. Now, as teacher, you were seated in front of this impressive-looking instrument, the shock generator. Its essential feature is a line of switches that goes from 15 volts to 450 volts, and a set of verbal designations that goes from slight shock to moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, and finally XXX, danger severe shock. Your job, the experimenter explains to you, is a word pair test. If he gets each answer correctly, fine, you move on to the next pair. But if he makes a mistake, you are instructed to give him an electric shock, starting with 15 volts, and you increase the shock one step on each error.
That is incorrect. This one will be 195 volts.
The learner was hidden from the teacher by a partition.
Dance.
Of course, this was all a simulation. Nothing was really happening. But the learner made very convincing sounds of pain as the shocks increased.
This will be at 3:30.
And Milgram found, surprisingly and rather horrifyingly, that the majority of people would actually go right to the very highest level if there was some pressure from a man in a white coat who said things like,
It's absolutely essential that you continue. Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My eyes bother me.
Go on.
Let me out.
in fact, about 65% of the people who he studied, who were normal volunteers from the ordinary population, actually gave the maximum number of volts.
This man was one of those 65%.
This one will be 195 volts. The correct one.
Let me out of here.
Slow. Dance.
Let me out of here. My eyes bother me. Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My eyes bother me. Let
Go
me
on.
out. Let me out.
Responsible for it. Red. That is incorrect. This will be at 3:30. The correct phrase is rich
Let me out of
boy.
here. Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me out, I tell you. Let me out of here. Let me out of here. You have no right to hold me
The
here.
next phrase is
Let me
fast,
out. Let me out. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
bird,
Let me
car, train, plane.
Eventually, the learner pretended to be unconscious.
Continue, teacher.
That is incorrect. This will be 345. The correct answer is fast, bird.
What we learned from that experiment is that people will actually do an awful lot when they're put under pressure from authority figures. And the problem is, of course, that when we obey the unjust authority figure, the person who gives us immoral commands, then, of course, awful things can go wrong.
So the question, my understanding is that the result when women were given this test was that it was very similar. Cheryl, I don't know if you have any more insight into that. Yeah, you're giving me the thumbs up. So, so here's the percentage. Go ahead.
He eventually did the experiment with women, and he replicated it under different scenarios. Like, he found out when you do it at Yale, more people will give intense shock than if you do it at a mediocre location.
Yeah, here's in fact that.
Yale.
This is in fact that information. So the original setup at Yale, 65%. If it was in an office building, 48% would go up to 450 volts. If they both were in the same room, 40%. If the teacher is holding the learner's hand on the plate, 30%. If it's by phone, if the experimenter is on the phone, it goes down to 23%. If an ordinary person is giving the orders, not the authority figure, 20%. If the teacher sees other teachers rebel and say, I'm out of here, it goes down to 10%. And if the teacher chooses the shock level, it goes down to 3%. I actually think, this is, for me, this teaching is consistent with the Jewish idea that we have good tendencies and evil tendencies, and they're at war with each other. And for me, the role of ethics, certainly the role of religion, would be to encourage, support, the Yetzer Tov, the good tendencies. So that's the issue of evil. I think the more difficult issue is tragedy. So tragedy is something bad that happens that is not the result of a human taking an action. So this subject is at the heart of Rabbi Harold Kushner's book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. Just to refresh your memory, Rabbi Kushner and his wife had a son named Aaron. And Aaron had a horrible disease called progeria, which is a rapid aging, and died at age 14. So here is Rabbi Harold Kushner, a newly minted conservative rabbi, trying to figure out, how could this possibly happen? What could Aaron have possibly done to deserve this? And so the logic of what he writes about is actually, I was taught by Ed Feinstein at Valley Beth Shalom here in the Los Angeles area. And he presents it in this way. According to logic, at least one of these statements must be false. Statement number one, God is all good and all just. Statement number two, God is all powerful. Statement number three, bad things happen to good people. By the way, they can all be false. By the way, if your position is there is no God, then you should have no trouble with evil, either evil or tragedy. Stuff happens. Certainly, you should have no issue with tragedy. But in Rabbi Feinstein's and Kushner's understanding, at least one of these has to be false. So we'll look at them separately. If I assume, let's assume that God is all good and all just is false. This is God as the laws of physics. This is the God of the Greek philosophers, the unmoved mover. This is the God that sets the universe in motion and then stands back and doesn't reward good, doesn't punish evil, has nothing to do with justice. And by the way, we're going to talk more about Job. This is Job's conclusion. Everyone talks about the faith of Job and the patience of Job. It lasts barely 1 or 2 chapters in the book. Job is not a particularly patient man. Clearly, Job believes in God. Clearly, Job believes that God is powerful, but Job absolutely asserts that God is not just. I'm going to jump to number 3. If bad things happen to good people is false, then there's 2 ways that can be false. Maybe the thing isn't really bad, or maybe the person isn't really good. So let's start with the first one. A baby gets a vaccine for whatever babies get vaccines for. And from the baby's worldview, a good little baby hasn't done anything wrong. All of a sudden, that baby has a pain in its tush. A bad thing has happened to a good little baby. But from our point of view, it's not a bad thing at all. In fact, it's a miracle. It's a wonderful thing that's happened. I have, in my role as a rabbi, spoken to people who've gone through horrible experiences. And although they may not wish that experience on their worst enemies, they would say, you know what? I came out of this a deeper person, a more spiritual person, a more understanding person, a more patient person. And in retrospect, I'm not so sure that what happened to me was a bad thing. So that's one possibility. The other possibility is maybe no one is really good. A bad thing can only happen to a good person if the person is good. So while there are many, 43,000 different branches of Christianity, many of them would assert that we are all born into sin, and that if good things happen to us, it's undeserved grace of God. And if bad things happen to us, well, we're sinners and we deserve them. And this is not just a Christian idea. In Judaism, certainly in Jewish mysticism, in Kabbalah, there is the idea of reincarnation, and that if a bad thing is happening to someone in this life, maybe they are being punished for sins they committed in previous lives. In fact, that's a pretty standard Kabbalistic teaching. A tragedy happens to a young person, and maybe they've worked off the sin. It's a way of working off sins in prior lives. Someone once mentioned this to Rabbi Kushner, and they said to Rabbi Kushner, maybe there's things about the way God works that you don't understand. And Rabbi Kushner's reaction was, there are things that my plumber does that I don't understand, but there's nothing about what happened to my son that I don't understand. So where I wind up and where Rabbi Kushner winds up is to say that number 2, God is all powerful, is false. And here the idea is that God sets the universe into motion and then doesn't interfere. So as I often describe this, if some idiot shoots a bullet in the air, the path of that bullet is determined by my old career, namely physics, rather than my new career, theology. God doesn't interfere. Presumably the God that created the universe, and said all of these, fine-tuned the creation of the universe and allowed life to happen, could have caused Mrs. Hitler to have a miscarriage. But that didn't happen. There's actually a couple of lessons in the Talmud from this, some of which are really fascinating. There are 2 commandments in the Torah for which if you fulfill the commandments, you are promised a long life. The first one is actually in the 10 commandments. It says, honor your father and your mother that you may long live in the land that God is promising you. The second commandment is kind of an obscure one. It says, if you take a baby bird from its mother's nest, shoo away the mother bird before you take the baby bird or the eggs from the nest, and you're promised a long life. So there's a story in the Talmud that says that a father asks his son, take the ladder, climb this tree, and bring me down those, I think, nestlings or eggs. And the son complies, puts the ladder up, climbs the tree. So he's obeying his father. So he's fulfilling the first commandment. And before he takes the eggs, he shoos away the mother bird. So he's obeying the second commandment. And on the way down, the ladder collapses and he dies. So as you can imagine, this is a subject of great consternation to the rabbis, and they argue about it, and they wonder whether it really happened. And they said, no, we heard this from Rabbi whomever. and we believe him. And then they said, well, I know, maybe he was thinking evil thoughts. And the rabbis say the Aramaic equivalent of give me a break. You know, he was obeying commandments. And by the way, Judaism understands that we're not punished for our thoughts, we're punished for our deeds. So they talk about it and analyze it and come up with the brilliant insight. The ladder was defective and the ladder broke. You are a wonderful tzaddik. You do good deeds. You give to charity. You volunteer your time. Mazel tov. Wear your seatbelt. Get vaccinated against COVID. Take your medications, because God isn't going to intervene into the laws of physics and biology to protect you because you're a tzaddik. There's other stories in the Talmud that would say it would be just if somebody stole seeds and planted them in their own field, it would be just if they wouldn't sprout, but we know that they sprout. So the teaching, as I understand it, and I think Richard probably raises the question about whether God chooses not to intervene rather than God cannot intervene. I've thought about this a lot. It's a subtle difference, but an important difference. If God can intervene and chooses not to intervene, then God is not just. That would be an act of injustice, not intervening. At least that's where I come out. So Rabbi Kushner and I conclude God doesn't have power over these natural forces. So then the next question is, I always look up and to see the title of the book that Rabbi Kushner wrote following his book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. He writes a book called Who Needs God? So the question comes, who needs such a God that can't intervene in nature? And I would say, and he says in a book length form, God's role is as a teacher, inspirer, commander, friend, and companion. That's the power of God. And I want to say more about that. Jason, you mentioned that the Torah speaks of extending punishment for several generations. Ezekiel comes along to absolutely countermand that idea. And it also says that the good deeds are rewarded to the 1,000th generation and the bad deeds only to the 3rd and 4th generation. So there's some interesting math going on here. So the question you often hear mentioned, let me connect with Richard first before we go on. Go ahead. You're muted. You're muted. Richard, you're muted.
In terms of your, in terms of your response to my question about whether God chooses not to intervene, and you said, well, if he doesn't, then he's not just. But maybe that justice is going to be meted out in whatever comes after this life. And
yes, so
and intervention in this world would cause more problems for us, even though we don't necessarily see it that way.
Yes,
more problems for humanity.
Yeah, I think that's a possibility. One, my next 3 classes are going to be a discussion of Jewish beliefs about the afterlife. And one of the ideas of the afterlife is justice. Again, this probably relates more to evil than it does to tragedy. Rabbi Kushner's son, did God really cause him to have cancer? That's what he's facing. Did he commit sins in prior lives and he was being punished in this life? I mean, Rabbi Kushner rejects that. I reject that. So the question then, broad question is, who needs God? What's the value of God? Or sometimes people will ask, God, where have you been lately? I've seen all these miracles. How about a miracle or 2 from me? And I like to think of this is certainly not even close to being original in terms of our relationship with God as Israel, as a people, like a parent to a growing child. In infancy, think about an infant, a baby crawling. Baby is crawling toward a source of danger. Maybe it's a stairwell, maybe it's a fireplace. All of a sudden, the parent picks up the baby. From the baby's worldview, the baby is now flying. The baby was a little hungry and a little wet. The baby is put into a crib. There's magical birds playing music, swimming around above the baby's head. All of a sudden, the baby has clean clothing on, has been powdered from above, and has a warm bottle to drink. From the baby's worldview, a miracle has just happened. Actually, several miracles have just happened. Okay, now the baby gets a little older, and we're out in the front yard and we're playing, and the toddler is going to be told by his parents, if you play in the street, don't go in the street. If you play in the street, you'll get hit by a car. Pretty simple. Now, if the parent were more, statistically inclined, the parent might say, Johnny, even though Johnny's 4 years old, if you play in the street, there's a 10% chance that a car might come along and a 5% chance that the driver might see you, leading to a 0.5% chance that you might get hit by a car. But that's a little complicated for little Johnny. So don't play in the street or you'll get hit by a car. Child now grows up a little bit and is having another discussion. And here's a real life discussion between me and my then 16-year-old son, who is an actor, and he just got his driver's license, and he's a pretty good actor. And he was invited, even though we're living in Thousand Oaks, to join an acting company in Hollywood. And of course, all of these actors are working at day jobs. So their company starts rehearsing at like 8 o'clock at night and breaks up at 11 or 12 at night. He's 16 years old, going to high school. And he makes this case to me about wanting to do this. And of course, I'm going to say no. Now, do you think my son's reaction was, thank you, Dad. I didn't appreciate all the subtleties and insights that your greater experience and wisdom and judgment brings to this difficult question. And I really appreciate your guiding me so beautifully and so lovingly in this way. Do you think that's what my son said? You'd be wrong. He was not happy. The final word in this particular argument is because I'm your father, that's why. And now I have adult children, at least they're chronologically adults. And I can't work miracles for them. I always say occasionally I can write a check and it may seem like a miracle, but as those of you who are adults and have adult children know, you wish you could do more. But there is still value in the relationship between adult children and adult parents. So I look at this analogy in terms of our both individual and collective relationship with God. I understand the stories in the Bible of these miracles, of the sea splitting, of, well, there's lots of miracles, a donkey talking, the walls falling down, the sun standing still, all of these things as our collective memory of our spiritual infancy. Our memory of our spiritual infancy is one where we remember God working these miracles. As we grow a little bit older, and now we're in the Torah, and particularly in the book of Deuteronomy, the book of Deuteronomy is actually quite clear. If you obey my commandments, good things will happen to you. If you disobey my commandments, horrible things will happen to you. And when I say horrible, the Torah is actually quite explicit about the horror. I'll just give you one example. One of these cases is if you disobey the commandments, if you obey the commandments, crops are going to grow, the rains will come in their times, your fields will be fertile, your animals will be fertile, everything will be fantastic. If you disobey my commandments, things will be so bad that parents of a child will fight over eating the flesh of their child. That's pretty bad. That's what the Torah says. If you obey me, good things will happen. If you disobey me, bad things will happen. Obviously, the problem is it's not true. In fact, we have an entire book of the Bible, the book of Job, that comes to refute this argument. In the book of Job, which I highly recommend to you, it's in your Bible, Job is a good person. How do we know Job is a good person? The narrator tells us Job is a good person. But Job, terrible things are happening to Job. Job's friends come along. Job's children die. He gets this horrible disease. His friends come along to basically preach Torah to him. His friends come along and say, if these terrible things are happening to you, it's because you've sinned. Renounce your sins. Ask God for forgiveness from your sins. God will forgive you of your sins, and you will be fine. And Job says, I know I haven't sinned. And actually, much of the book are these speeches of Job's friends and Job. Toward the end of the book, Job, who has more than a small measure of chutzpah, demands that God show up in the trial of God versus Job, where Job, I guess, is the plaintiff and God is the defendant, God is the defendant, the judge, and the jury. And Job basically lays his complaint before God, and God says, how can you possibly understand my ways? I mean, there's some magnificent writing toward the end of the book of Job, where he says to Job, where were you when where were you when I created the universe? And he says it, beautifully in a lot of different images. And so we would be left lost, with sort of the word, I'm God, you're not, except at the very end of the book, God says your friends are wrong. The friends, Job's friends, which simply quoted Deuteronomy, which simply quoted reward and punishment, God says your friends are wrong. It's more complicated than that. And today, I don't look to God for miracles. I don't look to God. Those of you who know me know my kids suffer from a disease that killed their mom, a genetic disease, and I don't pray to God to change their genes. I pray to God to inspire the people working on research. I pray to God that we will spend our money not on weapons, but on medical research. I pray to God for people to give me support and give them support. So the relationship, the shared wisdom, the love, and the caring is what I think is the central element of the relationship. So people talk about religious wars, and we often hear the claim that the worst horrors, the worst wars were fought in the name of religion. It sounds good, but it's simply not true. World War II resulted in the death of some 66 million people. Communism alone, 100 million people. Stalin, 20 million people. Communist China, 65 million people. The example that's often used as religious horror, and it was a religious horror, was the Inquisition. In its 400 years, put about 5,000 people to death. That was about a half a day at Auschwitz. And I always say, if you want to give somebody a book that you really, if the person isn't your favorite, give them this book, The Great Big Book of Horrible Things. It's a detailed discussion of the 100 worst atrocities in history. So the first one that has a clearly religious nature, the highest ranked one, is the Crusades, ranked number 30, with about 0.7% of the number of deaths, 3 million of the preceding 29. He actually categorizes the causes of these atrocities by various subjects, and religious conflicts he attributes about 19% of the total. In another text, the Encyclopedia of Wars, found that about 10% of 1180 conflicts were attributed to religion. So I'm going to go through this quickly. I go through this every time, almost every time I teach, and I hope I haven't gone through it with you in an earlier class. But there is a Jainist and Hindu legend about the blind people examining the elephant, and they each see a very different sight or feel a different sight. The one by the tusk understands the nature of an elephant as a spear. The one by the trunk says it's a mighty snake. One by foot says it's a tree. The one by a body says it's a wall. Person by the tail says the elephant's like a rope. This one says the elephant is like a fan. So, I often ask the question, which one of these people are telling the truth? And of course, they're all telling the truth. And then, it's clear that the truths that they are telling are utterly inconsistent. So maybe they should fight a holy war about who's really telling the truth, or maybe they should compare notes. And I would say this is the same thing about our fighting with each other and arguing with each other about the nature of God. Maybe we each can see and understand only a portion of God's totality, and our error is our certainty that we have the only truth. And then I love to add something to the elephant story. The elephant sounds, all these blind people hear the same sound. And I would say it's the golden rule. The idea that human life is sacred and we should treat others the way we want to be treated. And if you Google golden rule, you will find hundreds of statements in different religious traditions about the golden rule. The one I particularly like is a Native American tradition, which says, don't poke a baby bird in the eye with a stick until you try poking yourself in the eye with the stick. So does God care? For me, this is a true leap of faith. I don't find scientific compelling evidence for it or against it. So where does that leave me? That leaves me with a choice to make. The choice is, how am I going to live my life? And for me, the answer is, I am going to put on rose-colored glasses, and I'm going to assume that God cares, and the record of this caring is a revealed religious text. And having done so, I bring myself into an amazing world of relationships among people and with God. As a result, I find my life enriched and more beautiful and meaningful. And I've had the great privilege of helping others. I have no question that my life is assisted by many of you with whom I am in a relationship in the connection of my religious convictions. For some, I'm very involved in interfaith work. So it's not only with Jews. And I become part of this community. The word religion comes from the same root word as the word for ligament. It's what joins. And I have also no doubt in my mind that my role as a serious Jew has helped other people face difficult times. And Dayenu, we sing this song on Passover. It means it's enough. I'm not sure. You ask me if I'm sure? I'm not sure. Call me an optimist. Call me naive, guilty as charged. But this is the way I choose to live my life. So I want to summarize as I move toward the conclusion, and we can have a discussion. In deciding to live a religious life, I make two leaps of faith. That God, the organizing intelligence in the universe, exists. This one's easy for me because for me, the science is compelling. The second leap, which for me is a pure leap of faith, is that God cares. So where are we with the question that we raised in the opening of these three sessions? People talk about four models of the relationship between science and faith. Conflict, 6 days or 13.8 billion years, they're in conflict with each other. Independence, science deals with this, religion deals with that, they don't have anything to do with each other. Dialogue, we ought to be talking and getting insights from each other. And integration, that they really are both involved. And my position is either number 4 or I would go beyond number 4. I would assert that science and religion need each other. Dr. Piccioni's book speaks of harmony. I would go even further than harmony and say that it's necessity, that science and religion need each other. So I would go further than Einstein, who said science without religion is lame, religion without science is blind. If the purpose of religion is to make this world a better place, and this is certainly true in Judaism, and particularly in our branch of Judaism, in Reform Judaism, where we focus on the idea of tikkun olam, making the world a better place. If our purpose in life is to make this world a better place, we better understand how the world works, and then we can go on and improve it. That's science. As I always say, if I'm sick, pray for me. Knock your socks off. Pray till you're blue and white in the face. But help me get to a doctor. Help me get my medication. Help me get treatment. Support research into diseases. That, I believe, are the tools that God has given us to make the world a better place. But I would also go further and say science needs religion. One of the lessons of Nazi Germany is that a world of scientific progress, unchecked by religious ethics, leads to mass murder and maybe our extinction as a species. I often quote, I'm actually speaking twice to high school kids in Ojai about anti-Semitism. And one of the things you may not know, this is kind of an awful tidbit about the Holocaust, is the Germans were brilliant engineers. They could apply themselves to problems and come up with cost-effective and brilliant solutions, including the solution to mass murder. When they started, they gassed people with carbon monoxide in trucks, but that used valuable petroleum. Then they started just using firing squads. People would dig their own graves and they would just mow them down. But that used valuable bullets, and also the psychological impact on the soldiers who would spend an entire day shooting defenseless people was pretty serious. So they came up, these brilliant German scientists, with gassing people, and they optimized a gas, a poison, Zyklon B. But they wouldn't stop there. They had to gas people before they cremated them. They had to cremate them because we're talking at Auschwitz, 10,000 people a day. And you can't cremate people who are alive. They're going to fight you. They're going to resist being put into these ovens. And we have the testimony of guards in the Nuremberg hearings, when things were really at their most horrific, they would burn babies alive. They discovered they didn't have to gas the babies. They could simply throw them into the fires of the crematorium. And by doing that, they would save half a penny's worth of gas, and they could pack the gas chambers even tighter. And you wouldn't have, the horror of mothers screaming, holding their babies. So that's science without ethics. Science without ethics is amoral. It can lead to horror. And so just to amplify, if the goal of science is to expand our understanding of the world and make improvements in our way of living, then we better survive the weapons that we are creating, nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, biological weapons, and learn to live by the golden rule, by the ethical truths taught by religions. Science and technology are amoral. A knife can be used to murder or heal. With the advent of nuclear weapons, the ability to damage is unlimited. At least one source I found is that every thermonuclear bomb, or state-of-the-art hydrogen bombs, thermonuclear weapons, has the explosive power of all explosions in all prior wars. And roughly 100 such explosions would end life as we know it. Now, maybe the cockroaches would survive, and the algae deep in the oceans, or other forms deep in the ocean, would survive. But just 100 would pretty much eliminate humanity, and we have far more than that number around today. My belief, the only barrier to the use of such weapons and other weapons of mass destruction is religious ethics. Pope John Paul II said it beautifully. Science can purify religion from error and superstition. Religion can purify science from idolatry and false absolutes. Each can draw the other into a wide world, a world in which both can flourish. Pope Francis was an engineer, or I guess he's still an engineer. The late Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Schneerson, was also an engineer or a physicist. I'm actually not sure. So people that have awareness of both. So my bottom lines in this class is there is nothing irrational about belief in God as the organizing intelligence in the universe, and the belief that God cares. If we live as though God exists and cares, our lives are better and the world is better. If we are to survive and thrive, we better study both science and religion. And bottom line is Dayenu. Yes, there are doubts. Yes, there are problems, but this is enough for me. The next class, just to advertise what's coming, and then I'll end the screen sharing and we can see each other a little bit better and have a little discussion, is a discussion called What Happens After I Die? Jewish Views of the Afterlife. There's a wide range of Jewish views of the afterlife, And the discussion will take place on the next 3 Wednesday evenings. Same Zoom room, no charge for the classes. You probably have detected that the emails that I'm sending out periodically cover both classes, and, you know, invite your friends. And that is the end of the discussion. And let me see if I can get, I want to get the image that I have. Whoops. Okay. Yeah, this is so I can see you all a little better. Okay. So now I'll just open the floor for comments and questions and arguments that you haven't made before. If you've made the argument in the past, we don't need to repeat it. And I'm still recording, so be aware. Pixie, you're muted. And Pixie's in Texas, I believe. You're still muted. And you're still in Texas.
I just wanted to say thank you. This was wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And I had to tell you that because it's so much later here than it is in California. So if I sign off, I needed to tell you that first.
No, I appreciate that. And Pixie invited me to speak to, I guess, the sisterhood and brotherhood in your congregation, which was a kind of a 1-hour version of this 4.5-hour program. So thank you for joining it. And you're welcome, and have a good evening. Anyone else? Jane.
I've got to tell you, the first 2 weeks, I won't say it was over my head. It was over the ceiling. I mean, I'm not a scientific person, so I don't even understand how electricity works. All right. So, and I found, okay. But today, when I could see it between the science and the religion, it really brought it more, you know, it really brought it home. I still don't understand the first 2 weeks because I'm not that kind of scientist that understands the Big Bang Theory or any of that, but this week was spot on.
Yeah, so I appreciate you saying that. The point of going through the science is both my analysis, you know, Dr. Piccioni's analysis, and all these people I quoted. We have a lot of scientists who are very comfortable with these ideas. So I want to make the point through quoting them that it's not just kind of superstitious, uneducated people that embrace the idea of religion. Now, there are many, you know, educated people that don't embrace religion. There are many stupid people that do embrace religion, and vice versa. And by the way, I would never say that you need to be religious to be a good person. There are wonderful people who are atheists, and there are horrible people who are religious. But I wanted to make the point, because it's not always well made in these discussions, that there is nothing scientifically or logically irrational about being religious. So thank you. Joel and Judy. And you're muted.
Hi. So if God is not all powerful and can't perform these miracles, why would you pray to God for healing? Why do you pray to God for wellness?
It's a very good question. And there's actually prohibitions in Judaism for wasted prayers. And I'll give you an example of that. There are actually 2 examples. One is, it's in the Talmud. If you're coming into your city and you see a house is burning in your neighborhood, you are not allowed to pray that it not be your house, for 2 reasons. First, whatever house is burning, and your prayers aren't going to change that. So it's a wasted prayer. Second, it's you're also wishing someone else's house is burning, which isn't a very nice thing. There's even a prayer against, or prohibition against praying that a child, woman's pregnant, praying that the child be a boy, because the rabbis understood that gender was determined early in a pregnancy, and that was a wasted prayer. So the question is, what about the Misha Berach, which is very much part of our tradition, a prayer for healing? I have two reactions to that. One is intellectual consistency is overrated. That there are times when I am just feeling down and I just need to pray to God. And at those times, I am not being a theologian, I'm not being a scientist. In a way, it's almost like I'm being a child. And I want the comfort of a loving parent. And if that sounds immature, guilty as charged. On another level, there are some interesting studies which talk about prayers being helpful, and maybe it's a placebo effect. Or the fact that when we're in a congregation, and actually I think Christians do a better job of this than Jews based on the Christian services I've attended, where they will ask, are there any prayer requests? And they'll go around the room. And in a Misha Berach, people will be asked for names of people who are in need of healing. And by saying that name out loud, I know this from personal experience, people will come over to me afterwards and will say, oh, I didn't know, your child was sick. What's going on? Is there anything I can do? Can I help? Or maybe can I visit? Or let me give her a call? Or this person is sick and, haven't heard from him. And so I will call the person. There is, and I think I'm going to talk about this in the afterlife stuff. There is a fantastic record of a story. This is told by a rabbi who I know and trust in a book he wrote. And it goes like this. A woman who had a very bad reaction to some kind of treatment and was in a coma reported that she felt like the prayers that people were, she was aware, she was incommunicado, she couldn't communicate. She was aware that people were praying for her. And she described the feeling as one of like strands of a loving cocoon enveloping her and embracing her and helping her heal. The most interesting part of this, and this was years ago before, internet and cell phones, she asked, when she came out of this coma, she asked, and I don't remember the name of the family she asked about. She said, I was aware of these prayers, but I didn't feel the prayers of the Goldmans. Why weren't the Goldmans praying for me? Friends of hers. And it turned out the Goldmans were on a cruise and they were unaware that she had been in this coma. Oh, so there's more going on. I am open. It's hard for me because I'm a rationalist, I'm a physicist, but I have to admit there is more going on than I can necessarily understand. And in the words of your grandmother, it can't hurt. But I pray, and I pray for miracles. But when I'm being intellectually honest, I don't pray for God to reach into the genes of my children and correct a mutation in their genetics. I pray for God to guide the researchers to take them down productive paths rather than unproductive paths. I pray for the resources and the strength of people that care for my children when I can't be there to care for them. And, there's a wonderful line in our prayer book, which actually I think is originally from a Christian source, which says, pray as if everything depends upon God, right, and act as if everything depends upon you. And in the old version of our prayer book, there was a second line that says, those who rise from prayer as better people, their prayer is answered. Tim, my friend, Tim McDonald.
Yeah, as one of your Christian followers, to my friends, I always refer to you as my rabbi. And
I'm proud to be it. I always say to my Christian buddies, my goal is to be your second favorite rabbi. And I should explain to the Jewish crowd, the first favorite rabbi is always going to be Jesus.
Yeah, you can't get away from that. But a lot of times, I mean, when you talk about the prayer, I pray and I think, come on, give me a bone here. I pray and pray and I don't see answers, but I continue to pray because that's what God told me to do. So, I'll pray and God will answer in his way.
And do you find that helpful or comforting?
You know what? At different times, different reactions. But I think, I've got to do it. And I just saw a text or something where it said, yeah, I don't, God doesn't answer me. Or what has he given you? And I say, no, but he's given me peace, given me joy, and relieved some of these, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. One of the things that your comments remind me of was one of my teachers that said, just because something is comforting doesn't necessarily mean it's not true. Doesn't mean it's true, but it doesn't mean it's not true. And then often people criticize religion as being a crutch. And my response always is, if you've got a bad leg, a crutch is a wonderful thing to have. If you are having problems in your life, it is a wonderful thing to have, which is a source of helping you deal with those problems, even if the source isn't magical. Bryson and Lois.
Yeah, so the what I have gotten from this particular hour and 20 minutes or so is, I guess if I could sum it up this way, is that whether or not God exists, the world would be a better place if we all pretended he did.
The way I would phrase that is if we all act as though he did.
Well,
Because
if you don't believe, it's the same thing.
Yeah, yes. I mean, I won't quibble over that, but I would absolutely agree. And
but that's not a powerful argument for the actual existence of God.
No, it's not an argument at all for the existence of God.
Okay.
Which is why when I opened the discussion, I talked about two reasons to act as though God exists. And that was the whether or not there's a abstract good and evil, and whether life has meaning. Neither proves God's existence, but for me, it makes the life or the world a better place. Lois.
Okay.
I wanted to, I'm, by the way, talking to you from Studio City, California.
Oh, we have people in Texas and
right.
East Coast. Thank you.
I wanted to thank you for doing this. The content of this, I'm not aware of anyone else attempting to make this science religion discussion happen. And you're so unique. And I just personally really appreciate it, as do all the other people in your class. I also wanted to echo something that a woman said earlier. I think she was the first or second person who commented tonight about the Big Bang Theory and not knowing what it meant. And I agree with her, and I might suggest that a one or two simple sentence of something, the explanation of something like that would have been helpful for me.
Oh, okay.
And the last thing I want to say, I'm still troubled by your final leap of faith about whether God cares. I understand your rationale that it makes for better relationships and a better life, but it's very unsatisfying to me. I feel the same way I felt about Rabbi Schulweis, my rabbi here at Valley Beth Shalom, a blessed memory, with his godliness. As it's just not satisfying, and that's how I feel like I know I believe in God. Otherwise, I wouldn't be so angry.
I actually don't understand the point that you're making. Are you saying?
I'm just making a comment that I find it unsatisfying and not an answer to what you posed. Does God care?
So what I'm saying is, for me, there's no proof, so I assume I make that leap of faith. I see that as a religious statement of faith. I'm not. That's different than scientific certainty. So, when I look at all of the science, which may have left some people puzzled, it's hard for me. It's impossible for me to believe that it's just an accident. In the world of whether God cares, that for me, and it's very personal, is one of faith. I believe it. I absolutely believe it, but I don't want to confuse it with a statement that I believe it because of scientific evidence. I don't know is that what's troubling you, that it's faith rather than certainty? You're muted.
Right. It was just a comment about my own frustration with that.
Okay. Well, by the way, the word Israel means people who wrestle with God. So if you're frustrated and confused by this, welcome to the club. The name of our club is God Wrestlers. So if you're wrestling with it, fantastic. Jim.
Rabbi, if you could once more, is it that God created nature? Is it that he can't change it, or that he somehow chooses not to?
So the specific question is, somebody shoots a bullet in the air. Can God guide the path of that bullet so it hits a horrible person rather than a righteous person? That is the question. If God can do it and God chooses not to do it, to me, that leads me into questioning whether God is just, because God could do justice but doesn't do justice. Therefore, I have to question God's justice. And my own take on this is not to question God's justice, not to question God's goodness, but to question God's power. And here I do think that, religious Christians, and I think you're one of them, we're on different sides of the coin here. Particularly in the Catholic world, they talk about lots of miracles. And, I've got a problem with that. Actually, the rabbis had a problem with miracles. The rabbis were very concerned about miracles. And in the Talmud, they said all the miracles we see in the Bible were baked into creation, and there are no new miracles.
Rabbi?
So, yes. Yeah, Les.
You're saying that you shoot the bullet up in the air and it comes down and kills a righteous person. Remember the discussion we had a couple of weeks ago? If you're righteous life and then all of a sudden at the end you aren't righteous and you do things unpleasing to God. Let's take the scenario. It kills the righteous person. So he goes on, let's just say there's a heaven. He goes to heaven. It doesn't kill the sinner. But God knows this sinner somewhere down the road is going to become righteous and will be right, where if you were killed then, let's just say the usual, he's going to go to hell. But if he lives, he can turn himself around and he'll wind up in heaven.
Okay, so what you're describing, Les, is at the heart of Kabbalah. It's at the heart of Jewish mysticism. At the heart of Jewish mysticism, and it's really hard to get into it at this late hour, is the idea that God is all-powerful, is in perfect control of everything, and the world is evolving exactly the way God intends it to be. And that these things, we talk about, God took us out of Egypt, right? So, and it sounds wonderful, Ilu Hotzi Hotzianu, Hotzianu Mi Mitzrayim. God took us out of Egypt, and God was in charge and everything's great. Well, God took us out of Europe. God took us out of Europe by having 6 million Jews murdered by the Nazis. So if you take that, does that mean the Nazis were the tools of God's plan? Because if you take Kabbalah literally and seriously, the gas chambers, the nuclear weapons, Hamas rockets, cancer, my kid's Huntington's disease, these are all tools of God. I am not willing to, assert my theological wisdom over those of the Kabbalists, but I would say I cannot live with that theology. If I believed that were true, I would not be a rabbi. I can't work for such a boss. But that may say as much about my own deficiencies as the truth of Kabbalah.
Yeah, but like when you say God took us out of Egypt, I've always had a problem with this because for 400 years, our people lived in slavery, and they're saying, well, the next generation, the next. Well, these are people who lived their whole lives in slavery for 400 years, generation after generation. And oh, well, then we eventually came out of there. But what about the people whose whole life was miserable?
Right. What about all the people murdered in the Holocaust?
Yeah.
Was that simply God's tool for creating the state of Israel? I've got deep problems with that.
I hear you. It's very difficult.
I want to move toward a conclusion. Richard. Whoops.
Thank you. Regarding the question of whether or not God cares, I think one answer to that is that God wants that question to be answered by a leap of faith. If we knew for certain, scientifically proof, the ability to prove the answer to that question, it would change everything. If you could prove that God cares, then it's sort of, where would free will be? I mean, it would just change everything. So I think God has organized this so that in order to answer that question, you have to take a leap of faith, either one way or the other. There's no proof one way or the other. And maybe that is helpful in someone who's struggling with the question of, does God care?
Yeah, so I mean, that's what I took up with the idea of the police car example, that if we had certainty, and I didn't phrase it as God's caring, if we have certainty that God rewards good and punishes evil, if we had certainty of that, it would take away our free will. It would be like driving with the highway patrol car in your rearview mirror. You're not going to speed. So I agree with you. I also, I go through moments of faith. I would say, I wish I could decide, and that decision would carry me through 24 hours of every day. I think it's Heschel that talks about moments of faith. We have these moments of wonderful inspiration when doubts disappear and certainty fills us, and that's gone almost instantaneously. And religious inspiration for me lives in the memory of those moments. But I have to say, there's a lot of my day when I'm not so religious and filled with the glory of God. Any final questions, comments?
I do, Rabbi Motlocker.
Yes, hi, Miriam.
Hi. My head is spinning from all this information. I have a lot to mull over, and I thank you so much. And I'm so glad there's not going to be a test at the end of the class. Thank you.
Oh, well, I hate to disappoint you, but the way you live your life is the test. So
that's right. Thank you so much, and good night.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rabbi.
You're welcome.
Rabbi.
Pixie, do you have something else?
I just wanted to tell you that at our synagogue, when we were studying on Shavuot night, there was a quote from a part of Genesis that said, God is saying, if you spill man's blood, then your blood will be spilled. And it sounded like, God is going to punish you if you kill someone. And so people said, what do you think of that? And I said, oh, well, that takes away free will. And I gave the example of the policeman going down the highway. So thank you for that. And they thought that was really neat.
So what I will point out is what it's understood is capital punishment, is that in setting up a legal system, if you murder someone, your life should be forfeit. And capital punishment is the only commandment that's repeated in every book of the Torah. It's in all 5 books of the Torah. Now, the rabbis were uncomfortable with capital punishment, so they put a lot of safeguards around it. And it's not appropriate to go into it in great detail now, but they were really setting up a legal system. And of course, actually what you say Pixie, is actually the way they went on to interpret it, because very quickly, the rabbis had no power to do anything. I mean, once the temple is destroyed and there's no Jewish government anywhere that has any power to put anybody to death, what the rabbis say is if you commit a crime that is punishable by death, and there's others other than murder, that God will shorten your life. So, take it any way you want. Okay, Shirley, I can't resist.
Oh, thanks. I'm up in Northern California, as you know. Just a thought crossed my mind to perhaps tie together tonight with what's coming next week. And that is one of my rabbis says, you should live your life according to what you would like to have written on your tombstone.
Yes, yes. And, there's beautiful language in our prayer books that say similar idea that your life is a scroll, and write on it what you want to be remembered. And as you will see, as we get into the discussion in the coming weeks, there are beliefs, the medieval beliefs of a life review that when you die, you go before a court. And there was this great movie.
Yeah, with Meryl Streep.
Defending Your Life.
Defending Your Life. Yeah, I actually have it. And there's a lot of medieval thinking like that. And even in the Unatana Tokef, which is a prayer on the high holidays, which talks about who will live and who will die and so on. And it says, we have written it and we've signed it. So there is this sense that it's a statement of free will. You have the choice of how you live your life. I often think, again, not an original idea, that chance is the hand of cards you've been dealt, but you have the freedom to play that hand any way you want. It's certainly influenced by chance. Okay, gang, it's late.
Chance favors the prepared.
And I will see you in a week.
See you Monday night.
Or earlier, or Monday night, or Shabbos, or all kinds of opportunities. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
You are most welcome.
Thank you,
Bye, everybody.
Bye.